Today's biography is about Susan B. Anthony, fighter for women's rights. Susan B. Anthony lived from 1820 to 1906, when many basic rights were not extended to women. They could not own property, they were excluded from most jobs, and they could not vote. Anthony worked for more than 50 years as an activist for equal rights. She did not live to see women win the right to vote, but her brave determination paved the way for change. Let's learn about her life. Susan B. Anthony believed that men and women were equal, but she lived at a time when women did not have the same rights as men. This is the story of her fight for equality. Susan was born in 1820 in Massachusetts. When she was young, she loved to read books. In fact, she learned to read when she was only 3 years old. Susan's parents did not allow their children to play with toys or games. Maybe that's why she learned to read so early. When Susan was growing up, most girls did not go to school, but Susan did. Her parents believed that girls should go to school, just as boys did. I believe that made a difference, that her parents believed that the same, she should have the same opportunity to get an education just as boys. As a young man, as a young woman, Susan worked as a teacher. She was paid much less than male teachers were paid. Susan did not think that was fair, but back then many things were unfair for women. Susan was only 15 when she became a teacher. Wow, she was really young. These were some of the ways life was unfair for women in those days. Women could not vote. Women were paid less than men. Women could not own property. Women had to give their money to their husbands. Few women went to college. Few jobs were open to women. I think maybe because they couldn't vote, they couldn't change the rules and the laws. In 1848, a group of people got together to talk about women's rights. The meeting was called the Women's Rights Convention. One of the leaders there was named Elizabeth Cady Stanton. Elizabeth Cady Stanton spoke at the convention. Susan met Elizabeth in 1850. Elizabeth was passionate about women's rights. So was Susan. The two became friends, and they decided to work together for equality. Susan had heard about Elizabeth and wanted to meet her. That's how they became friends. They had things in common. They were both passionate about women's rights. Susan and Elizabeth believed that women should have the same rights as men. They decided to fight for a woman's right to vote. If women could vote, then they could change other unfair laws. Susan and Elizabeth talked about how women could win the right to vote. The two women formed a group that fought for women's rights. Susan soon became a leader of the group. They worked hard to spread the word about equality. Susan and Elizabeth started a newspaper about women's rights. That was clever. They could give away the newspapers and have people read and educate themselves about the women's rights. Not only women will read them, but also men will read them. Susan traveled all over the country to talk to people about women's rights. Back then, it was very difficult to travel. There were no planes and roads could be rough, but that did not stop Susan. And sometimes Susan traveled for months at a time. She often traveled by train. In 1872, Susan voted in an election for the President of the United States. More than 100 other women did too. This was against the law. Susan was arrested. Can you imagine becoming a criminal for defending your right to vote? She was arrested. Wow. For more than 50 years, Susan worked for women's rights. When she died in 1906, women were still not allowed to vote, but all her work had made a big difference. When she was 86 years old, Susan said in her last speech, "Failure is impossible." Women continued to fight for equality. And in 1920, almost 20 years, she died in 1906, but in 1920, the law was changed. And at last, women were given the right to vote. Susan B. Anthony's dream had finally come true. The law allowing women to vote is known as the Anthony Amendment. An amendment is a change in the law, in the Constitution. Let's take a close look to this diagram. I can see years, and I can see events. This is a timeline. It shows some of the important events in this book. So let's start. It starts in 1820 and it grows by 10, 30, 40, 50, 60, 70, all the way to 1930, from the 1800s to the 1900s. 1820, Susan B. Anthony was born. She learns to read at 3 years old. And the next event is 1848. The first Women's Rights Convention is held because she met a friend. A couple of years later, 1851, Susan meets Elizabeth Cady Stanton. They become friends. They were both passionate about women's rights. In 68, Susan and Elizabeth start a newspaper. And right after that, 1872, Susan votes in an election. She is arrested because then it was not permitted for women to vote. In 1906, Susan B. Anthony dies. But almost 20 years later, in 1920, women win the right to vote. This tells us that it's not just one person's job to make change. It takes many of us. But there are a few that are really good leaders, and they take it on to motivate other people to do the same.